Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. I am happy to introduce the two speakers of today, Willi Goetschel and Michael Hampe. Willi Goetschel has joined us previously to acquaint us with the wit of Heinrich Heine. Goetschel is Professor of Philosophy and German Studies at the University of Toronto, and this time he will be talking to Michael Hampe, Professor of Philosophy at ETH Zurich and initiator of the Metis project, about one of the most well-known and multifaceted authors of the German-speaking world, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Michael Hampe will be introducing Goethe and his work in detail. So all that remains for me to say is, happy listening!
Thank you, Elian Schmidt, for this kind introduction, and I want also to welcome our guest tonight, Willi Goetschel, and it's a pleasure for me to talk with him about Goethe. Goethe is a similar figure in German culture as Shakespeare in English or Molière in the French culture. He was already a towering intellectual figure during his lifetime in the second half of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, and still is considered by many as the greatest author of German tongue, who contributed to all literary genres. He wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, Elective Affinities, and Wilhelm Meister, epochal novels, with Faust, the perhaps most influential German tragedy, and with poems like Wanderer's Night Song and the Elf King, works that are known all over the world. But Goethe was also a botanist, a zoologist, who detected the intermaxillary bone, a mineralogist, and the developer of a theory of colors, a special phenomenology of color that brought him in a conflict with Newton's concept of white light being composed out of the colors of the rainbow. In a sense, he was, at least for the 19th century and perhaps for the first part of the 20th century, the German genius, and perhaps he still is. But today we would not look at his plays or his novels or his scientific works, but we want to look at him as a source for wisdom. For that we certainly have to talk about the fine literature he produced, but also about his relation to the philosophy of his time. And Willi Goetschel has written about Goethe and the philosophy of his time. But before we come to this topic, I would like to start with his novel Wilhelm Meister. It is considered, or that's at least what I learned when I was studying German literature, a Bildungsroman, and sometimes it is said that you need wise people in order to be guided in your education. And in Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre, there is a special society that seems to look after the development of the hero of the novel. And my first question to Willi Goetschel is, what is a Bildungsroman and how is the hero of Goethe's novel educated?
Thank you, Mr. Hampe, and also thank you for having me here. Yes, actually, Goethe's Wilhelm Meister novels are the two of them. They are the first Bildungsromane, the first formation, education, or culturalization novels we have in German. And so in that way, we can even orient ourselves on Goethe. The concept came up only in the 19th century, made and later what that is. But the idea is it's like the hero, the protagonist who goes out to grow up in the world, looking for meaning and finding him or herself. And so in that way, it's very much a novel about looking for practical life wisdom. But already this first novel has an interesting twist to this. So it's not an unproblematic novel where the hero goes out, looks for it and finds it. It's more complicated, and in a way he does and does not find it. And we'll talk about that in a bit. The Tower Society is an interesting concept that plays a role here. And I think actually it's nice to talk about that in English, because literally the Tower Society is looking out to what Wilhelm is doing. Whether they are doing a competent job or not is not so clear. We will talk about that. And the Tower Society, which is also having these people who are called, like the management people, who are called the Leitende Obere, the guiding higher ups, so to speak. They're never known. It's sort of an invisible, almost an invisible hand kind of thing in Adam Smith's version. And so it becomes not quite clear. And I think it is a question that the novel keeps asking about that. And as Wilhelm Meister goes through it, he undergoes his own education formation process, but also more importantly, the one of his son, Felix, the happy one, as Felix, the name itself means. And this whole passage in the novel, a large segment of the pedagogic province where they sort of go there. And basically the whole scheme of the novel is every father, every mother, every parent has this issue. Where does my kid get the best education? And the idea of outsourcing this, and an early critical view of Goethe here about the question of outsourcing. And basically, I would say, and I rarely have seen that in the literature actually registered, but basically the point is that Wilhelm with his son, they travel through all these parts of the pedagogical province, which is a super boarding school, sort of a super Harry Potter kind of a scheme. At the end of the day, Wilhelm learns more and more that as wonderful as all these institutional arrangements are, he's the father, he's in charge and responsible for teaching, raising his son, and none of those outside wolves will ever be able to really do that. And that's how the novel ends in a beautiful way, that when his son then at the very end has a steep fall, because he's a very abrupt, temperamental kid. And then at that point, finally Wilhelm Meister has finished his training as a doctor, a physician, and he's able to save his life. So basically, it's he who is doing it. So in that way, the novel is both, it's a thorough discussion also of the educational ideas of the time. There's like Pestalozzi, the Swiss pedagogue and educator, and his theory are reflected in the novel, in this passage. And they're reflected, but critically also, that at the end of the day, the best pedagogical theory is not going to do it if you as a parent are not behind it and basically doing your own share of it.
So we have Wilhelm and his son Felix as the two main characters who are to be educated, cultivated, whose development is described. We have the Tower Society, which is looking out, observing them. I want to come back to the titles of the book and to the name of the hero, Wilhelm Meister. The first novel is called Lehrjahre, Years of Apprenticeship, perhaps, and the second novel is called Wanderjahre. I don't know how that translates.
Journey years.
Journey years.
Yeah.
The surname of the hero is Meister, and that all reminds one of handicraft, of, say, a carpenter. As a carpenter, you first learn with a master, and once you have done your first table or shrine or whatever out of wood, you go around and work for different people. That's the second part of your development as somebody who's doing handicraft. And as far as I know, handicraft also plays a role in the Freemasonry Society. And Goethe was, if I remember rightly, a member of the Freemasons. In what sense does this whole topic of learning a craft, learning a handicraft, play a symbolic role in this novel? And is this novel an application of the symbolism? And perhaps you can explain this symbolism, because I think it plays a role in the society of the Freemasons as well. Is it a novel about the Freemasonry ideals of education?
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think he is addressing the theme and is playing it through. And Meister has, like the master, has all these different levels of meaning. It also comes up at some point in Goethe's famous poem about the artist, like you can only be a master if you know about how to rein in your freedom to be a fool, to fully be truly free. So master, it's also an academic title. It's all of that in different levels. And I think it's Goethe again, which is a main feature in him. He's always playing with it, sometimes with some irony. It's never a sarcastic or caustic irony, but it's a playful one. So Wilhelm Meister, in this novel, is also looking for his own calling, and he's looking for his own mastery in that way. And so in that way, he is called a master, but or called to be one. But the question is whether he never becomes one until at the very end. So there's also this play about how if you are a true master, you of course are not really a master, because then you would undermine the master. The very master is itself always one of searching. And so I think that plays definitely with the masonry imagery and symbolism, which is also building houses, building architecture, building society, building politics. And in that way, it's like embrace of this idea, and at the same time sort of I would say a differentiation of it, or some kind of a complication, making it more complex, what the name reflects itself. And that's something that's often overlooked, especially by scholars of German literature, that often the great figures, just like Faust too, as we will see later, they're often seen as identification figures of when this is like Goethe or this is like the great hero. And Wilhelm Meister himself, he is a very nice person. He's often a little bit incompetent, very likable. But it's not that Goethe thinks only positively. And towards the end of the book, there's a beautiful sentence where they talk about him as a problematic figure. So there's this irony that what Goethe does with his writing, and maybe that's actually also an aspect connection with life wisdom and wisdom, is that he writes his problems through his figures and his plots. So there's the problem figure of Meister, of a part of himself for sure, a part of us also often. And he doesn't heroize it or so, but he's actually acting it out in all its positive and negative aspects.
So the book is ironical, as you said, or playful in the sense that it does not show us how you become a master of your life, but the master who believes that he or she is finished, has learned everything, and is now able to lead a good life, cannot be a master because you have to be in search all the time.
Right.
Or have to improve all the time. But what role does the Tower Society now play? You said they're just watching out. Do they give advice? Do they evaluate the developments like a teacher does evaluate? Do they give marks? And do they help? Do they push?
Right. It's not so clear. They don't do that much, really. They are maybe almost a model of what, and the critique maybe of philosophy, actually. They give him general advice, like he's not supposed to stay longer in a place than, I think, 3 nights maximum. He has to keep going. So they're specialists in dispensing very general wisdom. And there's not much of a feedback. It only radiates out. So they dispense the wisdom, and we hear some tendencies, but they also show later on problematic aspects. The Tower Society is the one who organizes the colonization of the Americas, of North America, and also the internal German East colonization at the time. And so it's not so, and they have also problematic figures like exponents of themselves. And so they have an archive also, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so it's never really clear what's the agency? Like, who is actually running the society? Who is inside and who is outside? So it's a very esoteric society. And it could also be, again, like a playful critique of Freemasonry, like suggesting that, they do a lot of really good things, but it's also a little bit sort of an epigonal notion of how we would organize a free society. How could a society be actually free and self-determining if it's like guided by all it knows kind of people? And so I think that, and it's never clear. We get always hints here and there from different figures. We don't know really many of the figures. They usually don't identify as being, they only usually identify as messengers from the Tower Society. So it's almost Kafkaesque.
Yeah,
it's always a messenger.
How ironic do you take this description of the Tower Society? Because perhaps it is a topos of wisdom literature that true wisdom is hidden in an esoteric society behind the walls of the Platonic Academy, say, and only certain people are allowed to enter it, and only sometimes people from the academy step outside onto the marketplace and give an exoteric talk, say. Is this Tower Society something like a secretive, esoteric society? And does Goethe point to the problem of keeping wisdom inside an esoteric club, or does he believe that wisdom is something that only a few people can really understand?
Right. It's a little bit of both, I think. I start with the last one. I mean, Goethe definitely thinks, like many people, that truth is not available necessarily for everybody, just because emotionally most people shut themselves off. So it's not in principle not available for everybody, but it's just a scarcity on the market. I think that is definitely a concern. And he has a beautiful line in Faust where he says where the teacher, I think it's actually even Mephisto is saying it, where he impersonates Faust to the student, where he says, the best things you can't even tell the students. And so there's that concern, and he's playing with that, but at the same time, he's critical of the Tower Society in the way that anything that the Tower Society says is, as I said, very general, and it is esoterically handled. That's the problem of the Freemasonry. But they also just cook with water. And so when they go outside, in a way, what the whole process of the novel shows, by the time it's translated to the outside also has known it already all along. So it's more like an esoteric duplication of what general wisdom might be anyways. So I think that is what is at play definitely here.
So society handles something secretly, which is in fact not a secret.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another problem of this novel might be that, which is related to wisdom, is that how can you communicate wisdom? And it seems to me that the novel uses a lot of different forms in order to communicate with the reader. It's not just a plain story about Wilhelm and Felix, but there are shorter stories integrated into the novel, and we have a collection of aphorisms from the archive of Macaria. And if I remember rightly, these aphorisms have been published by Goethe separately also. Why did he choose these almost postmodern form of having a novel, and inside the novel short stories, and inside the short stories aphorisms? What is the function of this multiplicity of forms in these two books?
Right. I think it's one of the first novel, like really modern novels in that way, or in a way maybe even bordering, as suggests, to the postmodern. And I think that's the macro structure that itself is already a piece of wisdom, is that this is a novel where the use of apprenticeship is self-enclosed. It closes at the end, like a traditional novel. The second one, The Journey Years, is opening up, and that makes it generally fascinating. So there's no final wisdom there. It is really this opening, and that's its ultimate wisdom. And within this wisdom or this structure, everything else is falling into particular places. And one of the principles is like we can call it the drawer system or the file cabinet system, that Goethe had some of these stories and maxims and aphorisms written, and then he looks where to place them. The more seriously, the question is, there's also stuff that didn't make it in, like the elective affinities was supposed to be a central heart piece, because simply the sheer size of the proportions of the novel would have gone completely out of bounds. I mean, by now, I think the normal is like 500 print pages. With elective affinities, you would have another 200 or more pages on top. And as you suggest, so some of these stories, they're all like sort of like Goethe liked this concept of repeated mirroring, the idea that things mirror themselves in other things and reflect themselves in other things. So in a way, the stories reflect other stories and comment other stories, and there's main stories and frame stories, and it goes back and forth. And so they signal some kind of meaning making in between them. So a lot of the meaning is produced just through the storytelling, also through the individual characters and their smart and silly actions they do. And not just Wilhelm, but there's a whole universe of figures that show up, disappear. And then, of course, there's this big enigmatic story with these aphorisms and maxims, and they are allegedly all written by this fictional character Makarie. And Makarie appears very marginally at some point. There's a lot of speculation. She is a near-stellar human being that is almost post-human, in her way a pure spirit.
Sophia himself, perhaps.
Right, exactly, something like very strange. And so all those are ascribed to her, and they pop up occasionally. And they produce, of course, also the hermeneutic question each time when you read one of them, how are they supposed to be understood? So there is this multi-genre project going on here. And that itself is also an interesting comment, that there's no single genre that is going to give us the meaning, giving us the wisdom. So wisdom, literature itself, so to speak, becomes part of a larger project. And Makarie is very interesting because of this strange position she has. So she is a very highly admired figure, but she's also so strange that it's like she's not relatable. And so that makes it, again, like everything in Goethe is always like, has all these different aspects. Like you can't reduce him to a straightforward story. That's not what he's doing.
Yeah. In the later 19th century, I think it was, but you have to correct me if I'm wrong about this, it was coined by Kierkegaard, the distinction between direct and indirect communication. And sometimes it's said that you cannot communicate wisdom directly, that you have to pass wisdom over to other people indirectly. And some people say that this method of mirroring you just described, by connecting short stories inside the big novel and having aphorisms in it as well, is a method of indirect communication, and that there is one important topic of wisdom in the novel called renunciation, which Goethe might communicate indirectly by this method of mirroring. I think one important short story, if you can say short story or novel within the novel, is Der Mann von 50 Jahren, the man aged 50 or so. And that this little novel is about renunciation, and that what Wilhelm Meister learns is also renunciation. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit what renunciation means, if it is really a central topic in this novel, how it is to be distinguished from resignation or becoming desperate or depressed. It sounds like quite a negative term first, and not usually wisdom is about how do I become happy and not how do I renunciate something. So what do you think about the method being related to this topic? Is there really an indirect wisdom about renunciation communicated in this book?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and there's a lot of debate about it. So the novel is, and it's a legitimate question because the subtitle is, it's Wilhelm Meister or die oder or der renouncing ones, die Entsagenden. And so the question is, of course, what Entsagung is, and it's because, as you say, also in German, Entsagung is not something people want to jump on. It's very ascetic. The question is, but then these people are not super ascetic in the novel. I mean, they are a little bit holding back. The question is, it becomes, and yeah, it goes through the novel throughout, not just the Man of 50 Years. It's a very stark example because it's a beautiful text to read when you turn 50. I like to give it to my friends when they turn 50. And I read it, and it's hard.
Can you summarize it shortly, please?
Yeah, so the Man of 50 Years, he's already a vain person. And so, of course, it's all about not aging. It's a sort of critical of the ageist paradigm. And so he decides to do everything. And it's amazing when you read in the 18th century what they already could do, including false teeth, false hair, everything, dermatological products. He's a consumer of all of it.
So it's a midlife crisis novel? Or?
It's about midlife crisis. Mm-hmm. And he then learns slowly that he doesn't get anywhere with that. And the growth spurt is then when he can embrace his age and become dignified again in a way. And so it's actually very much, you could almost say that actually people who, if they would want to not age, if the anxiety of actually growing up would be a strange kind of an asceticism, almost anorectic in some ways, like the anxiety not to live, actually, whereas he actually finds that life comes with costs and that's all good. And so it is a beautiful story that stands on its own.
Mm-hmm. But if you would produce the aphorism, accept your age, then you would produce a triviality, so to say.
Right.
By telling a story, you communicate this wisdom in a different, non-trivial way. Is that right? Yeah.
And it's this general wisdom, actually, of when if you know somebody has a problem or you want to explain something, that you tell a story, and the storytelling is so much more powerful than logical rationalization or like logical deduction, because it plays with your empathy. You give an actual story. Even if it's invented, it's a story that's based on so many people's experiences. And that's what definitely is going on. The other thing is that it becomes fascinating once you think what Entsagung or the renunciation might be called in Latin, which is acquiescentia. Mm-hmm. And then acquiescentia, of course, is Spinoza's central concept in the Ethics. And I don't make it up, but maybe Danzel, like there was a literary historian in the 19th century who wrote a little booklet on Goethe and Spinoza, or Goethe on Spinoza. And his idea is that this is really a Spinozist concept. And I must admit that first I had a hard time to see it, actually. But once you actually see it in terms of this acquiescence into the reality of life, in Arabic, of course, there's also a beautiful word for it. It's called Islam, actually. That you acquiescence with the reality, with what is, then that is like a way to become yourself, become independent and self-determined. And so I think that part runs certainly through the novel. I wouldn't say necessarily the main motive, because I think that's another part of this writing in Goethe, that all these motives are interconnected, and there's not just like one, there's always another one, and like there's more like a constellation or a weave, like maybe that's a better word, even a literary fabric or a literary weave of ideas that together produce the wisdom. Just like real life wisdom too is like there's never just one. Like there's not read a book or drink water or, but it's always like a context. And that's the other part, I think, which is so important, which comes out here, that of course there's no meaning without context. So you need to create a certain context to then actually come up with wisdom, so that it actually like gets anchored and secured in some kind of a referential system.
Mm-hmm. You gave us already a very elegant move to relate Goethe to the philosophy of his time, especially to Spinoza. Goethe was not like Sartre or Camus, a philosopher who wrote both treatises and novels. So one would probably not say that Goethe was a philosopher, but he was also a scientist and an artist or a writer. But as you've shown in your piece, Goethe and Philosophy, he was an eager reader of the philosophy of his time, even of the most difficult bits of academic philosophy, like the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Judgment by Kant. And he liked, as you show, Kant quite a lot, and said that Kant was the most influential philosopher of his time. But what one knows is that his view of nature was very much influenced by Spinoza. Perhaps you can describe how Goethe picked up Spinoza, why he read Spinoza, and what influence Spinoza had on his thinking in general.
Yes. Spinoza was really a crucial figure for Goethe, and very early on, maybe one of the earliest philosophers that he was interested in. Before I say more, it's also to enforce what you mentioned, that Goethe never saw himself as a philosopher, but he was somebody who read far and like everything basically, and was generally interested in anything, any kind of form of knowledge. And so philosophy was of deep interest for him. He read Spinoza very early on. We don't know how much at which point. There are different stages in his life. But I think it is clear that you can see this reflected in his early poetry, very strong, the very early nature poetry. You can also see it in Faust, reflected the way he talks there about nature, that Spinoza for him is also an important figure, I think, because he was not seen as a serious philosopher by many of the contemporary philosophers of Goethe. He even complains at some point that when he tries to argue for Spinoza, people like Jacobi, like they knew it all better, and they basically put him into his place.
He was considered to be a determinist who didn't accept the freedom of the will, and therefore the whole picture of the enlightenment that humans have to develop their freedom and their personality was supposedly disturbed by his view. Is that the right?
That's correct, yeah. And even further, because of that Jacobi thought he was almost like a nihilist. On Spinoza, like if everything is rational and rationality is at the end of the day nothing, then we are sort of going for disaster. And Goethe saw it differently. He knew it differently also, one could say, but he hadn't the philosophical eloquence and vocabulary. And so, but what to argue with Jacobi at that point, and he didn't feel like it. And Jacobi then famously actually took this one poem, or two poems actually, by Goethe and published without his knowledge. And that's how the Spinoza conflict started. And Goethe was really upset about it because he wasn't asked, but felt exploited and used.
And what does he say about nature, or how does nature appear in these poems?
Nature appears there in the later one sort of more calm, more clarified. In the early one, wild, which is both aspects of nature in Spinoza. Spinoza's neutral. There's no moral indictment or a statement about nature is just nature, and nature is just everything that is. And so I think that was really like an opening for Goethe. You mentioned in your introduction, like how his wide interests in natural sciences, into everything, like into And what is interesting, and I get to understand more and more since my wife is really interested in rocks, and rocks don't speak much. I mean, you can talk to them, but they don't talk back. But they are extremely interesting. They grow, they change, they are like other things in some ways, but they tell us a lot about the origin of our Earth, the early developments. And so that somebody like Goethe to even turn to an inert object like rocks, and the rocks, they actually figure prominently, literally prominently in Wilhelm Meister. Even the opening is on a peak, on an edge, on a deep cliff, which if you know about rocks, you can already decipher what is going on and where it is going. So this interest, I think that was something that Spinoza gave him theoretical framework to think about. The other part, which is very important, is the theory of affects, that in a way you can read the ethics, as you very well know, as sort of a therapeutical manual of like managing, channeling your own. And there's something calming and reassuring when you read as the ethics in a way. And I think that's the part where Goethe picked up when he read it. He read it in also a very difficult period. At some point, he reread it in a difficult period in his love affair with Charlotte von Stein. And it seemed to calm it. It seemed suggested that by Margarete Sussman especially, that Charlotte von Stein was the one who turned him to Spinoza and said, you are a mess emotionally. Read Spinoza and get it straight. And so I think the or the gratitude of this reading experience is what further reinforced it. And as well as the idea that this was a philosopher that philosophers are all critical of, so there must be something that must be interesting about him. So I think because Goethe, I mean, as big and towering as he is today, as the super canonical figure in German literature, he saw himself, young Goethe certainly, and midlife Goethe wasn't really that established. And so that was the person, because Spinoza was the outsider, the one who thinks critically and usually does thought experiments, all things that Goethe does himself too.
For our listeners, I might point out that we made a podcast with Willi Goetschel about the therapeutic impact of Spinoza's ethics, and if they are interested in more details, they might search our website for that podcast. I want to continue the relation between Spinoza and Goethe with turning to the problem of God or theism. It is sometimes said that Spinoza was an atheist because he did not believe in a personal God who has a certain aim with the world, but said that God is nature, or that God is a substance that is everywhere in what is turning up in nature. So being a Spinozist could often lead to the accusation that you are an atheist. On the other hand, there is a reading of Spinoza as a pious philosopher who was a pantheist, who saw God everywhere in nature. And there is a book, I've forgotten when it appeared, it was during my study time, by Albrecht Schöne, called Goethe's Farbentheologie, the theology of colors of Goethe, where he says that Goethe, in a sense, identified the light with God. And because God cannot be cut into pieces, it cannot be true that the prism experiment by Newton cuts white light into the colors of the rainbow, but it's just darkening the white light, so the colors of the rainbow are the effect of white light being darkened and not being divided. How much do you think that Goethe was, because of Spinoza, a pantheist, and how much did he really believe that light is divine? Or perhaps you can point out in a more general way the religious stance of Goethe, if he had one, and how much it was influenced by Spinoza.
Yeah, the one question is the light question first, maybe. So, yeah, there is some discussion about the Spinozist connections of the color theory. I don't see it all the way, or I see it partially also because there are some very problematic aspects of the color theory, like not scientific ones, but ethical ones. There's, unfortunately, real racism in it. where basically the light-colored humans are, higher rated. And I remember when I read it, I thought like, no, he's not going there. He's not going there. And then he went there, right? So the light metaphor, of course, is very traditional, a theological one. And that's why you cannot look into the light, like you cannot look into God. I think you could get that from all kinds of different backgrounds. You don't need to necessarily go to Spinoza.
Can I do Plotinus as well?
Yeah, a biblical Chinese, like probably all cultures would reflect because it's so universal. The question of religion in Goethe is also complicated because he probably believed, like we all do at different moments, different things. He was definitely a pantheist at some point. He called himself cheerfully the great heathen or the great pagan, but then he also chose diplomatically often to write in Christian registers. So it's not clear where he went. And you could say that maybe Spinoza in that way would be a figure he could turn to also, who is in that way like if nature is really everything and nature is substance, so all there is, which is also God, which all there is, then it's a different type of spirituality. And the advantage with Spinoza was certainly that he was not canonized or appropriated by any particular religious institution or sect. And so it was wide open enough to like that you could actually relate to that. So I think that part was definitely where he would feel close to Spinoza. I don't know how close, but I think the general framework would be definitely that. But also with Goethe, talk about whether he was a religious figure is it depends what aspect of Goethe you look at. He generally likes to cast himself as a very worldly figure, and worldly again maybe in a Spinozist way, which is also of course religious, but not in a traditional religious understanding.
The works that seem to relate to religion in the most straightforward way is probably his tragedy Faust, because it starts with the famous bet between the devil and God. If the devil is able to catch Faust and bring him on an evil path, so to say, and at the end, Faust does not end up in hell, but in heaven. And this is not a tragedy that has any pantheistic overtones. So it seems, and you might say, well, this is not serious, this is irony. So is Faust an ironic work about God, the devil, and Faust? That's the first question. And the second question is, in the 19th century by philosophers like Kuno Fischer in Heidelberg, lectures in philosophy were given on Faust as if it was a philosophy text. Why did it have this impact on philosophy? So it seems that although Goethe, as you said, never tried to be a philosopher, he became a philosopher with this tragedy, because philosophers were reading him and interpreting the drama, the tragedy, in order to distill some sort of anthropology, of wisdom out of it. So these two questions, what type of relation to religion does Goethe has in Faust, and why did this tragedy become so philosophically important?
Right, yeah. Again, like the second question, first maybe, I think it's a great text to teach philosophy because it's a manual of a lot of great ideas that Goethe rehashes or reformulates or just formulates. And so that aspect is clearly there, but it is framed as a religious kind of tragedy. And even the entire theme of the Gretchen part, the famous Gretchenfrage, as we call it in German, which is like this most simple, direct question that she asks is,
do you believe in God?
Exactly. And then, of course, he answers in such a non-committal way that she says, well, that's what you say, that's what everybody else says as well. So good job there. So it's interesting also to see, and I didn't realize it until lately when I was working more on Job, that the book of Job is, of course, very present in the play at the beginning, the deal they have, so to speak, which rewards or resonates with the book of Job, which is one of the really great ancient wisdom literatures.
And has the same betting situation, I might say.
Yes, exactly, yes. And is itself a famous piece of, that's what it was. It was not a religious text initially, it was a wisdom text. And so Goethe plays with that. And so that is the framework. And it is the play, it's the question about the religious dimension, definitely. And the question is, how do we deal with it? How do we understand it? And there's another way where also actually the light comes in the second part. The second Faust 2 starts with Faust not being able, like looking at the sun as it sets or rises, but indirectly, because again, you can't directly look, and it's a Moses constellation just with the biblical Moses. And so there is a deep spirituality playing through in a way. And then there's also the problem with the end of Faust, where then, as I'm not sure whether Nietzsche or somebody else said it, Goethe sort of activated the entire Catholic apparatus of redemption to get Faust up there after she already decided miraculously that Gretchen is, saved, because a few Ave Marias seem to do the job. And she has a terrible life with Faust, and Faust became terribly guilty.
I may inject here that when I saw an instant version of Faust 1 and Faust 2 with my son being probably 13 or 14 or so on the screen, he became furious with the end. He said, it can't be true that Faust gets into heaven. The devil is deceived. The devil did a good job. So he was taking sides with Mephisto, and I understood his mood.
Right, yeah, no, and there's this whole plane, it's almost a technicality on which Faust actually gets saved. And the technicality, it's just because Gretchen decides it's the female side that sort of is the redemptive part of it.
Is it irony, you think, this last bit?
No, that is actually, irony and not, of course. It's also... maybe the redemptive part of man would be woman in that way. And a generous woman would maybe reciprocate that way. And it doesn't have to be a patronizing view necessarily, but it is like, it's also because she is the one who forgives him, of course. Like he wronged her, and you can only be redeemed by the one who basically forgives you, and you cannot force, and he doesn't even expect her to forgive her.
Mm-hmm. So it's Gretchen who does the redemption and not God.
So one could say that, but one could also say God redeemed her. So it's, the way I see it is, I think what Faust does is that religion is not just happening in the church. And that's actually very nicely done in the first part, where actually a lot of it happens in the church in Faust 1. But it spills over into the garden. It spills over into reality, into modernity, actually. And the entire Faust 2, with all these criminal things that Faust actually does, are definitely of biblical proportions. And so that becomes, but I would see it more as a medium or as of expression, an indirect way, if you want to say, rather than a particular belief. And Faust is very sophisticated that way as a play to show, because Faust, when you look at it carefully, is actually not a hero. He's actually, again, like Wilhelm Meister, just more so a profoundly problematic person. He's sort of the actually bad colonialist and does all the things we should not do.
The tragedy is also a sort of biography of Faust, I would say. He starts with Faust probably being 50 or so, or perhaps 60. He is
30. He's
30.
Yeah,
I always imagined him being older. Okay.
Which I know is old for my students, because they told me 30s are pretty old.
Okay. And he wants to commit suicide because he thinks he doesn't know enough and he will never know enough. And then he gets even younger than 30 with the help of the devil and has a different career from a university person. And sometimes this description of his career has become emblematic, that man is always striving like Faust, and that in his striving he is doing more harm than good, and the Faustische in man is talked about by many philosophers. And Goethe himself has not only written about this fictitious Faust, but also about himself. He has written an autobiography, and the first, perhaps strange question I have is, how much does Goethe appear to be Faustish in his autobiography?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is something a little bit self-aggrandizing sometimes. It actually from the get-go. He modestly starts the Truth and Fiction, his autobiography, with the constellation of the stars, which align just right for the start of German literature, which is him, of course. And I was just thinking of it also in terms of the very opposite of Montaigne, when he will talk about himself, that in Truth and Fiction we have some kind of we have self-reflection, of course, because when you write about your own life, even if you make yourself into a big figure, there's always automatically a self-reflection there. But it's also a big self-production at the same time. And so while the novel, that's a good Freudian, because there is the Truth and Fiction, the title in English is not so good because it's more like Truth and Poetry. That would be the real title.
Yeah.
There's this, and I think that's the philosophically interesting point in his autobiography, that they're always mixed. Like there's, you cannot tell the truth without a narrative, and the narrative needs poetic imagination because it's a reconstruction. And so it is a great read. It's a long read, but there are actually interesting, very interesting moments in it of descriptions of what is happening. And so in that way, it's a reflection of a very long life and also of the specific constellations in that life. So in that way, as we said before, sometimes you teach through indirect narratives. There's something like that too.
Mm-hmm. And is there a reflection on topics we just talked about, like renunciation, striving and causing harm by striving, although you mean good? What we saw in Wilhelm Meister and what we saw in Faust, does that come up again in his own portrait? Does he see that in his own life too?
Yes, to a certain degree, he reflects on it and he discusses it. The problem is that at that point when he writes it, he's also a minister. He has a political appointment.
Like Faust as well, no?
Yeah. And so he's also, as Heine criticized him, he has to be political. So we don't know, how much it is truth and fiction in that way. But certainly that reflection, that self-reflection goes through, and it's interesting as a model of like how, when you have your own life, how do you think about it, and how it looks so differently looking back from like living it in the moment. And that kind of tension that produces itself a really interesting cognitive situation.
Mm-hmm. A last personal question. How do you read Goethe yourself? Are you using him as a source of wisdom or just as an object of your study?
Yeah, I'm a little bit spoiled with my life. I really only read people I like, or at least I write only on people I like. And I can't really, I'm not good at reading people. I can't connect. And so I do read Goethe for fun also. And I mean, the poetry, for instance, when I teach it, it's actually always fun just to read and reread it again because it's so beautiful and it's so smart also. And you find always like things that directly speak to you because it's so fresh. That's the poetry. The other writings too is, I find, when you read Goethe, there's at the best moments, there is a moment of intuition or like way of self-reflection where you sort of feel like you're like reflecting on your own life as you read along. And where Goethe create, like when he talks about Kant, he says, when you read a page of Kant, it's like you enter in a brightly lit room. With Goethe, when you read him, it feels almost like you walk into an open room, or it can even be an open nature in which that gives you enough space to reflect on yourself, and that doesn't, because it's so light, it's so serious at the same time. So you feel sort of at home in an interesting way. Not at home, like literally at home, but in a safe place that helps you generate ideas.
Mm. Thank you very much, Willi Goetschel, for sharing your knowledge about Goethe with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have reached the end of today's Wisdom Talk on the life and work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and I would like to invite our listeners to follow further Wisdom Talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. You can also find more information in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.